Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is that the conversation around the Shabbat dinner table this weekend and for many weekends was similar to conversations we've been having for the past several months. Almost every year now, that's the way it works. And I would venture to say that it's probably the same conversation that's been taking place around Shabbat tables and kitchens across the world since COVID began. We spoke about COVID and the devastation COVID has wrought on our personal lives and on our community. We memorialized those who succumbed to the deadly virus. We spoke about, and in many ways honored, the survivors. We spoke about the thoughtless many who continue to place our lives and countless others in jeopardy blithely, sometimes even intentionally disregarding simple rules of COVID survival etiquette.
Blue lives matter! Blue lives matter!
He's giving you to suffer. You are our friends.
Yes.
De Blasio is not your friend.
Yes.
De Blasio is a Hitler and Nazi.
We shook our heads in absolute stunned disbelief after hearing about a Hachnasat Sefer Torah that was celebrated in South Florida. During pre-COVID era, Hachnasat Sefer Torah, the welcoming of a newly scribed Torah scroll into a synagogue or community, was much like a wedding. It was a grand celebration, a time of great joy for the community, for the family, or for the donors who were contributing this significantly large gift. There was dancing and singing through the streets. That's what happened before. There was a special sumptuous meal, of course, a Sudat Mitzvah. That's what we did before COVID. All that was, I thought, a thing of the past, because during COVID, celebrations and weddings of bar mitzvahs were muted, celebrated modestly, with proper precautions in place, but not this time. Not this Hachnasat Sefer Torah. It was an event to remember. Members of multiple synagogues came to participate. Everyone was there to celebrate, and celebrate they did. Few masks, and even less social distancing. And a virus that ran rampant. The virus went home with the participants much like a goodie bag or a swag bag. And then they brought it into their own synagogues. And now many people are sick. Many synagogues have been infected. It was due to a flagrant violation of COVID protocol. It was sheer arrogance. It was astounding ignorance. Too many people, successful in their own chosen fields and careers, are just plain ignorant about the dangers of the coronavirus. They assume that if they do get sick, they'll simply get a minor case. They calculate that they will be able to live through it and live with it. And they never think about the possibility, the real possibility of infecting a high-risk person who may die because of their willful disregard of medical advice and governmental mandates and rules. They are too self-absorbed to realize or care about the ramifications of their actions, that before they actually get symptoms, they might actually transmit the virus. And they have never heard of long haulers, a big danger. Those are people who have COVID and have recovered from COVID, are suddenly, several weeks later, symptomatic again. Not positive, just symptomatic, with symptoms, often very different symptoms from what they originally had. And they can persist for months and months. We all know people who lost their taste and smell for a week or two, but long haulers often still have no sense of taste or smell after 4 months or 5 months. We know people who were fatigued or had brain fog during COVID. For long haulers, those symptoms persist and persist and persist. Insomnia, nausea, muscle weakness, fatigue, and the list goes on. According to a recent study, as described in the Wall Street Journal article, there are over 1 million long haulers in the United States suffering from extended complications from COVID. The phrase is not a medical phrase. It's not Latin. It was coined by a woman named Amy Watson, a preschool teacher from Portland, Oregon. Toward the end of April, Amy plopped on a trucker's hat with a squirrel on it and went to get a COVID test. It was a bad hair day for her. After having chronic headaches for weeks, she took a selfie, and then she created a Facebook page as a support group for people like herself who were still suffering from COVID symptoms long after they were no longer COVID positive. long-haul truck drivers, long-haul COVID survivors. The name seemed appropriate, and so Amy's group was called Long-Haul COVID Fighters, and it became very popular as more and more people recognized what was happening to their bodies. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci recognized how appropriate the name was and used it to describe those who continue to suffer COVID-like symptoms. This virus is still a mystery. We are almost daily subjected to new and evolving dangers. As hard as it is to face, as hard as it is for many people to accept, we will not be returning to our pre-COVID lives. Not very soon, at least, if we do. But every day also brings new information and new hope. Vigilance is essential. Compliance is essential. Even with vaccinations, we must still be careful and play it safe. The rabbis taught, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh. All of Israel is responsible for each other. In today's COVID world, we need to expand that. Not just all of Israel, all of humanity is responsible for one another. It's a new year. Let's do our best to make it a healthy year.
No, I definitely won't take the American vaccine.
The next thing I've been thinking about is New Year's messages. It's unbelievable. Even terrorists see the importance of sending out end-of-the-year messages. Sheikh Hasan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, sat down in a secret and secure bunker somewhere south of Beirut, in Beirut, but sort of south of southern Beirut, for a 4-hour interview with Al Mayadin, a Beirut media organization. Nasrallah knew that his words would have weight. He knew that people would pay attention. He chose his words and his topics carefully, and among the many kernels of essential material this diehard terrorist dropped was his assessment of the final days of the Trump presidency. He called the outgoing president of the United States angry and crazy. That's a quote. He cautioned that one must be extremely careful. He explained that the situation is tense and may lead to conflict. Nasrallah clearly received talking points from his sponsors, i.e., the Iranian leadership. Most important, Nasrallah claimed that within the past year alone, Hezbollah has doubled their precision missile cache. He warned that Hezbollah now has the capacity to strike every inch of Israel and the West Bank. There is no way to confirm this. However, he went on to say that Israel has attempted to prevent Hezbollah's acquisition of these weapons, and they failed. There is good reason to believe that Nasrallah is correct. We know that Iran has consistently attempted to airlift and then ground transport weapons to Hezbollah. And we know that Iran has consistently tried to build missile factories for Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon. When we hear that Israel has bombed Lebanese and Syrian targets, we should realize that the targets they hit are often the arms depots and convoys Nasrallah is speaking about. Israel cannot strike every single missile factory, every single target, every convoy. Attacks first require intel to identify the targets. So inevitably, Hezbollah missiles get through. But just imagine how many missiles Hezbollah would have if Israel were not hitting those targets. Hezbollah has been extending their reach. They have become extremely active in Europe. Reports of Hezbollah being involved in money laundering and illegal art sales and illegal diamond trade have emerged. When arrests are made, the trail can often be traced back to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has been linked to drug trades. With expansion comes a crunch. The time for Hezbollah's growth coincides exactly with tough times for Iran. Iran is still sponsoring Hezbollah, but they are feeling the trickle-down effect, and as a result, they're searching for new forms of revenue, new sources. And that is dangerous. Dangerous for Hezbollah, certainly, but that's also not my worry as much. It's dangerous for us and for the Western world. When Iran was their exclusive sponsor, Hezbollah bowed to the will of Iran. Iran had red lights on Hezbollah's operations. They had operational control, especially against Israel. It required Iranian clearance. But should Hezbollah become independent, they will be free to quite literally fire at will. Hezbollah does not have the same discipline of Iran. Hezbollah has tunnel vision, and they do not see nor they care about the big picture. And that changes the paradigm, and that makes for a very volatile situation. But it also appears that some in Europe and elsewhere are waking up to Hezbollah's threat. Until now, most countries separated their terror arm from Hezbollah, from their political arm in Hezbollah. There were also the social, cultural, and educational arms of Hezbollah. Those countries felt comfortable condemning Hezbollah's terror branch, but not Hezbollah in its entirety. Now, however, it appears that many parts of Europe and South America also have awakened to the complete threat Hezbollah presents. Over the past 18 months, 16 countries have announced that they consider the group in its entirety, that means all of Hezbollah's many varied branches, to be part of the terrorist organization. 10 of the 16 countries have made that declaration to the effect in the past 6 months. They include, by the way, Germany, Great Britain, Netherlands, Lithuania, Estonia, Guatemala, Honduras, Argentina, Colombia, and most recently, Slovenia. In fact, Slovenia has called on other European Union countries and all of Europe to follow their decision. Hezbollah is now an entirely well-trained and experienced fighting force. The civil war that ravaged Syria afforded the Hezbollah terrorist army the opportunity to hone their skills. They are well armed. Each and every unit and every fighter has been battle-trained and battle-tested and is comfortable with modern weaponry and technology. This is not the same Hezbollah that Israel confronted in 2006. Neither, by the way, is Israel the same Israel in its military. The scariest part of Hezbollah's transformation is their unpredictability. Hezbollah ultimately driven by ideology and religion. That means Hezbollah uses a different calculus for decision-making than do other armies. One of their criteria for engaging in conflict is anathema to Western ideals and values. When in pursuit of their religious and ideological objective, the loss of lives is not an issue for them, not the loss of innocent victims and civilians, and not the loss of their own fighters. Even massive losses leave Hezbollah leadership unfazed. Nasrallah may deliver an end-of-the-year message, much as other leaders do, but that's where the similarity ends. His motive is not to soothe and send well wishes. His motive is to command respect and instill fear. Nasrallah is not hoping for a happy new year. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Allgemeiner. It was published on January 3rd, 2021. It's entitled, "It's Time to Be Unapologetically Jewish." It's authored by a college student. Yes, a college student named Karen Shalev from Worcester, Massachusetts. Karen is the Stand With Us Emerson Fellow at Worcester State University. She is majoring in visual and performing arts and communication. The column describes anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial on her campus at Worcester State University. It's shocking to read. It's shocking to read about her travails and the anti-Semitism that students need to confront and endure on campus. This is how Shalev begins. 2020 has seen even more anti-Semitism. Following the FBI's 2019 report stating that Jews experienced over 60% of religious-based hate crimes, despite making up less than 2% of the population, the Anti-Defamation League marked Massachusetts as the state with the fourth highest number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2019, with 114 incidents recorded. Worcester, Massachusetts, is the second largest town in New England, located about an hour west of Boston, with a population of 182,000. It's a vibrant college town, home to 9 institutions of higher education and 36,000 students in a regular year. One of those schools is my school, Worcester State University. Now Karen Shalev she's given us the background into Worcester. She goes on to describe some of the anti-Semitic incidents that took place there. This is how she writes. Following 2 separate incidents of swastikas on my campus in December 2019, my university held an anti-Semitism program in early 2020. Soon after, we received notice of another swastika drawn on a whiteboard in the classroom in the same building and floor where the previous swastikas had been found. Although it was later reported that the swastika was mistakenly left on the board after a class lecture about visual literacy, leaving the swastika on the board speaks of a tone deafness that particularly affects Jewish students. In the local community, Temple Beth Israel was broken into. A man was arrested after breaking into Temple Emmanuel Sinai, harassing parents and children outside our Jewish community center and kicking a Star of David. This is literally hair-raising. I can't tell you that. It's amazing. If this is not enough, Shalev goes on to describe how one of her professors denied the Holocaust and defended his denial on a test, no less. In other words, he actually taught Holocaust denial. Listen to what she writes about what happened. I also experienced Holocaust denial in an online class, which is bad enough, but especially difficult for me because my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. A professor gave a quiz asking what motivated Hitler to order the killing of thousands instead of millions of Jews. I sent him an email explaining the erroneous numbers. He did not respond. I followed up letting him know that this phrasing leads directly to Holocaust denial and that as a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I was significantly affected by the inappropriate phrasing of this question. The professor responded that the textbook states the correct number of victims and that the point of the question was not how many people died, but the reason behind it. He made a concession, stating that he went back and edited the question to make it clearer. But it was after the test had already been locked. No student could even access it. Unquote. I'm so surprised and impressed that Karen Shalev actually had the wherewithal to respond to the professor and insist on the correction, even if no one saw it. Good for her. Karen ends by proclaiming that, quote, our Judaism manifests differently, but no matter how it manifests for you, be Jewish, unapologetically, end of quote. Well done, very well done, and very insightful. This essay gives us an inkling of what it means to be Jewish on campus today, and it's horrific. Coming up next is a column from the Globe and Mail. It was published on December 31st, 2020. It was written by Casey Babb, and it's entitled, I'm thrilled to become a father, but I'm scared to raise a Jewish child in today's climate. Babb is a senior analyst at Public Safety Canada, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, and a PhD candidate at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. This is how Babb begins. 8 months ago, my wife and I found out that we were expecting our first child. After many months of trying, the news we had a baby on the way was an incredible thrill. Finding out that I was going to be a dad was the happiest I've ever felt. However, as these days and weeks went on, and the physically distanced get-togethers with family, friends, and colleagues waned, something dawned on me. I'm Jewish. My wife is Jewish, and therefore my son will be Jewish. As someone who believes deeply in the survival and the growth of the Jewish people, this was an emotional and consequential realization. Yet at the time, it was also unsettling in a way I had not anticipated. Discussing with a child or a young person the tragedies and horrors that in large part have characterized the Jewish experience is hard enough. Preparing them for future prejudice, hatred, bigotry, and potential acts of violence they might encounter is something entirely different. Babb raises huge questions and important ones. And now comes the issue of Judaism and anti-Semitism. Babb writes, growing up in Canada, I didn't necessarily know what anti-Semitism was, but I knew from a young age that Jews were targeted. In some ways, life was different for us. It was probably going to be different for me the older I got. Babb concludes by listing the challenges, and there are many, and then he writes the following. I fear we may be on the precipice of another perilous chapter in Jewish history. What might all of this mean for my son? How do I explain these things to him? How can I prepare him for the future? My parents taught me how to live. Will I have to teach my child how to survive? Babb is thinking about the big questions. He's thinking about the future of the Jewish people and the place he and his child will occupy in that future. I hope that every mother and father begins parenthood by asking similar questions and follows through as they involve themselves in the shaping of the Jewish education of their children. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you a few items today. Some are observations and some are cartoons. These first few items are actually observations. The first is, this morning I saw a neighbor in the park talking to her cat. It was obvious that she thought her cat understood her. I came back to my house and told my dog. We laughed a lot. It's a COVID experience. The second is a play on the weight and weight gain during COVID. I haven't cut my hair since COVID started. Yesterday, I stepped on the scale for the first time in a while. Who knew that hair weighed so much? That's hilarious. The third piece is so simple and yet so profound. My husband brought a map of the world. He gave me a dart and said, throw this, and wherever it lands, that's where I'm taking you when the pandemic ends. Turns out, we'll be spending 2 weeks behind the fridge. Hilarious, brilliant, and funny. And for our final observation, marijuana is legal, haircuts are not. It took 50 years, but the hippies have finally won. And now for some cartoons. The first cartoon is by Daryl Cagle. He's a master. It's called Stop the Crazy. A husband and wife are having their morning coffee, and he's reading the newspaper. He answers her obvious question saying, no, the crazy hasn't stopped today. And that's how I feel every day, I must tell you. The second and the last cartoon is actually from Dry Bones, Yaakov Kirshen, and it's called The Peace Parade Marches On. There are several flags depicting Israel, Bhutan, and Morocco all together. Watching from the sidelines is a figure representing the Palestinians. This is so insightful. The Palestinians could be joining the peace parade, but they choose instead to stay on the side. In a moment, more of my perspective and a few predictions. Iran is obsessing over United States President Donald Trump. They're thinking that Trump will attack Iran in his final days in office. Look at this tweet from Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Zarif warns the United States not to attack Iran. He warns that Iran will defend itself, so beware, Zarif writes. Instead of fighting COVID in the US, at real Donald Trump and cohort waste billions to fly B-52s and send armadas to our region. Intelligence from Iraq indicate plot to fabricate pretext of war. Zarif is claiming that President Trump is manufacturing a pretense so that the United States can attack Iran. A military advisor to Iran's supreme leader warned that the United States president, quote, not to turn the new year into a mourning for Americans. This is just one of many episodes, one of many examples out of Iran. The essential lesson to learn from Iran's behavior is that they are wary of Donald Trump and believe him to be very unpredictable. Iranian leadership does not know what he will do and what he can do, even to the point of an attack on Iran in the last hours of his presidency. Morocco is the fourth nation to announce normalization with Israel. Over the past 3 decades, I've got to tell you, Israel and Morocco have had secret relations, especially in the areas of security, terror, and even foreign affairs. This is despite all that, there have been serious blowback against the move to normalization. In Morocco, let's say, for instance, and throughout the Arab world, there is talk that normalization is the abandonment of the Palestinians and that Donald Trump's lead is a real mistake. There is no way of knowing what the numbers are of how many Moroccans support or reject normalization in Morocco. Morocco is not a democracy. However, it is clear that the move will help concretize and increase relations between Israel and those interactions that have been in place for decades, especially in terms of safety and security. Naysayers are exaggerating the damage that will be done and underestimating the benefits to Morocco. The landscape is changing in the Middle East. As more and more countries are warming up to Israel, China is playing a more significant role in the Middle East. You get the point here. That's not good news. Israel must tread very carefully. China is determined to develop deeper relations and become more involved with various Mideast countries, and Israel is on that list. As the Trump era wanes and the Biden administration emerges, China is going to want to play more and more effective roles and active roles in the region. China cannot replace the United States. It is abundantly clear that that's the case. But Israel will want to gain some of the advantages China has to offer. These include investors, tourists, high-tech production, and most importantly, low-priced imports. Trump did not look kindly at the Chinese advances towards investments in Israel. We do not know how Biden will view the move. It is imperative for Israel to understand that while China may become a business partner, China will never be a friend. Anti-Semitism still exists, and we've spoken about that. And that should not come as any surprise. We just read about anti-Semitism on campus, let's say, for instance. The Simon Wiesenthal Center in LA published a top 10 list of anti-Semitic outbreaks in 2020. Number one was that Jews created COVID. Again, not a surprise. The report clearly explains that from the earliest stages of the pandemic in February 2020, far-right extremists across social media platforms blamed Jews and Asian Americans for the virus. One example of that hatred is demonstrated through an image titled "Hollow Cough" that urged, if you have the bug, give a hug. Spread the flu to every Jew. Another example is demonstrated through a Trojan horse with a Jew inside a globe. The head of the horse is COVID-19, and the people at the gate of the city invite the horse in. The idea that Jews created to spread COVID-19 is obviously a canard. The most unfortunate part is that many people are living among us believe these ugly stories about Jews. And that, I'm afraid, will not change or go away in 2021. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. We spent significant time today talking about anti-Semitism. Actually, we spent time in general talking about it. Anyone, certainly any Jew who is interested in the Jewish future, should be deeply concerned about the increase in anti-Semitism. Lately, I've stopped using the term anti-Semitism, actually. I prefer to use the term Jew hatred. Today's Jew hatred is similar to the historic, classical hatred of the Jew, the kind of hatred that existed before the rise of the modern term anti-Semitism. The modern term anti-Semitism was coined by Wilhelm Marr in Germany in the late 1870s to describe a new hatred of the Jew, one which was not based on the old theological hatred or cultural hatred or religious hatred. This anti-Semitism was scientific. It was not the Jewish religion that was hated, it was the Jewish people and the Jewish race. Today's hatred echoes back to the visceral hatred of the Jews before Wilhelm Marr. As my bubby used to say, these anti-Semites learned to hate Jews from their mother's milk. We are entering a new era of Jew hatred, yet history repeats itself. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.